The White House says President Barack Obama will meet Friday with congressional leaders to discuss what to do about $85 billion in mandatory spending cuts. The top Democrat and Republican in both the House and Senate will attend. It's the first face-to-face meeting between Obama and Republican leaders this year. Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell says it's a chance to address ways to reduce government spending. He says Americans won't accept more taxes as part of a deal to avert the cuts. The across-the-board cuts are set to kick in on Friday, so the meeting will come after Congress has officially missed the deadline for averting the cuts. And joining us to discuss Friday's automatic spending cuts is Virginia Democratic Senator Mark Warner. Senator, thanks for being with us.
Bob, thanks for having me, but I, like most of the folks in the Valley, have got to wonder, how do we get ourselves back to this 11th hour position? There is a chance tomorrow, Thursday, that there'll be a plan that we will put up in the Senate that will be half cuts, half revenues, which I think will be a better option than literally the kind of most stupid of all options, which these cuts are. In many cases, cuts that will actually cost the taxpayer money, because we will break long-term contracts in terms of volume purchases. We will end up, for example, research at JMU and other universities, it might be a 3 or 4 year contract. We won't be able to let the last year of the contract, so that all the previous research will be delayed. When you lay off poultry inspectors 1 day a week, that means 20% less eggs, for example, or chickens getting to the grocery store, driving up prices. You know, we need to cut government, but this is literally set up to have been the worst way possible, and it's embarrassing that it would go forward.
Senator, political analyst Dr. Bob Roberts from JMU says the sequester will happen, and it will be a few weeks before action will be taken, because each side wants to see who will start to get blamed. Is that assessment accurate?
Bob, I sure as heck hope not. But what we've seen is we've lurched from one crisis to another. Neither side is willing to make the kind of significant compromises that we need. You know, on the Democratic side, we need to do entitlement reforms. On the Republican side, we need to do more revenues. What was achieved on New Year's Eve is not anywhere near what any of the broad bipartisan plans like Simpson Bowles or Gang of Six laid out. And yes, we are going to need to do cuts. But as a former CEO of a business and a former governor, there's a smart way to do cuts with discretion, or there's a stupid way to do cuts, which say, for example, with the Navy budget, regardless of the effectiveness of all 975 programs in the Navy, we're going to cut them all equally. That's not the smart way to do business.
Now, Republicans argue that the president got his tax hike on January 1st during the fiscal cliff deadline. That's when the tax cuts were extended for all except those making more than $400,000 a year. Don't the Republicans have a point, Senator?
Well, Bob, if you look at any of the balanced plans that say we need to do about $4 to $4.5 trillion of cuts, entitlement reform, and revenues, all of those plans had as a minimum $1.2 trillion of new revenue. What we did on New Year's Eve was about $600 billion. That's half that number. When we have already done in total, not counting sequester, about $1.6 trillion in cuts. So we need more cuts, absolutely. We need more revenues. No one has said that we don't need more revenues. And we need to put entitlements in terms of meaningful entitlement reform so that Social Security and Medicare are going to be here 20 years from now. That means both sides are going to have to give, and it's ridiculous that we wait till the 11th and a half hour before we have any of these talks get started.
Well, it is the first face-to-face meeting between Obama and Republican leaders this year. Does that fact show a lack of leadership on the part of the president?
Well, you've had some of the Republican leaders say they didn't want to do any 11th hour deals, didn't want to deal with the White House. You know, we've gone through weeks of whose original idea it was to have sequester. Sequester was set up to be so stupid that no rational people would go along with it. You know, who gives a hoot at this point whose idea it was during the summer of 2011? I wish we would have gotten earlier down to finding a solution. I continue to work with Republicans in a bipartisan way. We've got a very detailed plan, but we're going to need both sets of the leaders to try to be willing to say, hey, let's give reasonableness a chance as opposed to who's simply scoring political points.
Do you think there's a chance for a compromise between the two extreme positions? You know, the president says half cuts, half revenue. The Republicans say no tax hikes. Could you do something where it's two-thirds cuts and one-third revenue?
Well, I would take a look at anything, but let's not just deal with this $85 billion to get rid of this year. Let's go ahead and put out a $1.5 to $2 trillion plan and get our balance sheet right, get the debt to GDP ratio headed in the right direction.
Okay, but on a quick note, doesn't doesn't the impact on Virginia with this $85 billion mean that something needs to be done about that right now or very soon?
Well, yes, and that's why I think the plan that's going to lay it out tomorrow is one solution. If there are other options that would allow the president to move some of these funds around so it's slightly less stupid cuts, I'll look at that as well. But we shouldn't have gotten to the 11th hour just as we did on New Year's Eve. It's pretty disturbing.
All right, Virginia Senator Mark Warner, thank you so much for joining us.